J. Warner Wallace is a cold case homicide detective who's been investigating cold case murders in Los Angeles County for over a decade. His work has been featured on Fox News, Dateline, and Court TV. Now, we join him as he applies his investigative skills to making a case for Christianity.
Thanks for joining us at Cold Case Christianity. I'm J. Warner Wallace. This week we're going to talk about something that is really kind of affects all of us. I think all of us at one time or another can say we have probably been inappropriate in some way, or maybe a little bit feisty, or maybe a little bit cantankerous. That's an old expression that's never get used anymore. Online, right? With our interactions online. If you're a podcaster or a blogger, or you're just somebody who's using social media with your friends and family members, you probably either, number one, sense there are times when other people can act this way, or times when you regret the fact that you acted this way. When you acted like a Chihuahua. What I mean by that is if you've ever owned a Chihuahua, you kind of know that they can be kind of protective and mean-spirited and barky, and they kind of, have you ever had a Chihuahua? I had one for years. We got her as a rescue dog, and I'm telling you, I regretted it probably within a day. But then you were already stuck with this dog, right? And on the bright side, they only live about 20 years. So we had this little Chihuahua for a long time with my kids as they were growing up. And I will tell you that for the most part, there were days when I couldn't, why would anybody own a Chihuahua? Yes, they are very loving, they're cute, they're small, they're lap dogs, I get all that. But man, there were times when they were loud and barky. Her name was Ginger, and she was so, she would nip at your heels. If a stranger would come over, she'd be very aggressive. I mean, there are times, most of us, when we think about Chihuahuas, we think, oh, cute, but kind of a pain, right? Oh, okay, well, is that what we want to be online? Maybe we claim an identity as Christ followers, but when you interact with us, we're kind of a pain to interact with because we're always nipping at people's heels. Look, I'll tell you that on my social media platforms, which I include YouTube, people are constantly making comments. And we are so polarized right now on social media, and we are so tribal on social media that for the most part, those comments are either like cheerleaders or people who want you dead. There's like these extremes, right? And I'll tell you, I have to do one of two things, either block or mute people or do what I have to do to make sure that there's not a lot of profanity online. And you see so much of that if you want your comment section to reflect the same kinds of Christian values you hope to reflect in your videos or your blog posts or whatever it is you're commenting on social media, you're going to have to moderate some of that, right? And you can do this on Twitter, for example. You can either block or mute people. And I find myself doing one or the other. And here's what I mean. Like, if you've got somebody who's got an atheistic worldview and they really are looking to just be, like I always say, you're the nail that they're trying to be the hammer for, well, you can at some point block those people. But on the other side of this, there are many times when you've got Christ followers who can be such Chihuahuas online that you find yourself having to mute them at the very least. You don't want to be unkind to somebody who is not using any profanity. It's not like they're being vile in that way, but they're just displaying a nature, a relentless nature that is unbecoming to a Christ follower, that at some point I just don't want to have to see it anymore or even be enticed into responding to it. So you find yourself muting people. So, which means basically you don't see their comments. They're making comments, but you're not getting involved in those comments because you're not seeing them to begin with. Now, look, why would you do that kind of thing? Because we have a tendency when you take off the profile image and you remove the identity, if you're not using your real name and real pictures of your family as part of your profile, it's really easy under that anonymous kind of heading to say things and you shouldn't say and to act a way you shouldn't act. So what I want to do in this episode is to show you how not to become a Christian Chihuahua, somebody who's constantly nipping at others' heels, is always behaving in a way that's unbecoming for you as a Christ follower. So, and by the way, if you're not a Christian, this is just a good policy, some simple policies that'll keep you from sounding like a jerk online. I could have entitled it, How Not to Be a Jerk Online, okay? But in either case, I'm going to give you some basic principles. Now, I have written about this on our website, so you can see a little bit more about this in an article. The first one, I'm going to cite 2 articles today that I've written. The first one is this one, How Not to Become a Christian Chihuahua. So some of this stuff will be a little drawn out a little bit more and explained a little more on that article. So let's just jump right in and talk about a couple of things you can at least think about as you are navigating the online world. Now, look, I'm going to use the Chihuahua as an illustration. So I'm going to give you 3 characteristics of Chihuahuas that I think can look, they're noble characteristics in some ways, but they usually lead to some form of Chihuahua misbehavior. And so why would we want to behave that way as well, right? So let me just start off with the first characteristic of Chihuahuas, which is good in some ways, but can be bad when it is abused. And that is that Chihuahuas are smart to a fault. Smart to a fault. That Chihuahua I owned, I always marveled at her ability to navigate, to watch carefully, figure out how to get around things. Sneaky, oh, so sneaky, but super smart, right? Very intuitive also, where it felt like she could understand our feelings and our emotions, right? She could read us. She could play one of us against the other. You know, if she had been fed by one of us, she knew how to make sure the other one did not know she had been fed yet, so you get fed twice. This is just the way the Chihuahuas are smart dogs. My dad had a dog for years named Woody. I'll never forget. He was a black Labrador, and he used to say that, man, Labradors are not the smartest. They're sweet, but they're not smart. And he was constantly having to make sure his dog would not run into the street, because if he got outside the yard, the fenced yard, would always want to go in the street because really had no sense of the danger. Just the sweetest dog, though, but would run up to even danger, to strangers, to whatever it is. Now look, isn't it interesting that he associated that sweetness with his dog Woody's kind of lack of intelligence? On the flip side of that, Chihuahuas are super smart, but often fail to be sweet like a Labrador. What is it about intelligence or insight that helps us to, or causes us to be less than sweet? I think when we kind of, we puff up under our level of knowledge, right? And this is what you see over and over and over again online. One way we can combat being Chihuahuas is to simply get over ourselves and realize that, yeah, you might have some skills, you might be smart in some areas, but there's always somebody who's smarter. And besides, if you know that you maybe know a little bit more about a topic, how we actually demonstrate that to others makes a difference. I think sometimes we can feel like we are so smart, we know so much, that we can look down on people online who maybe are just starting a journey where they're just starting to investigate certain claims. And so we are constantly, I've already heard that complaint. This is why that's wrong. Well, really, that can't be our attitude. We start to become like Chihuahuas. Do not let what you think you know start to change the way you behave toward others. It's a couple of verses here I'm looking at online that I've kind of cited for this, is that when we look at 1 Peter 3, right, we typically see the first part of the verse, be ready to give an answer to everyone who asks you about Jesus. With gentleness and respect part, we have a tendency to let go of. People who have answers or think they have answers need to be admonished to use gentleness and respect. Why? Because sometimes our knowledge, and we'll talk about that in the second section of today's podcast, but our knowledge sometimes causes us to treat people poorly. So the first attribute of Chihuahuas, their high intelligence. Let that be a warning for all of us who think we know more than others, that it's really easy to slip into Chihuahua mode because you're super smart. And that's what I think Chihuahuas do, and it's one of the reasons why have you ever noticed that when Chihuahuas are a part of a group of dogs, they have a tendency to be the alpha dog? They have a tendency, to be honest, in some ways they're manipulative. Even within their own species, they can be manipulative, and that little barky dog who's constantly barking ends up controlling the entire pack. And a lot of it is because they're loud and they're aggressive, but they also they know how to use that to manipulate others. Don't do that, okay? If you want to avoid being that kind of person online, understand that your intelligence, or what you think you think you're smart, that might be leading to the problem. Now let's go to a second attribute of Chihuahuas that I think can contribute to their feistiness, okay? And that is that Chihuahuas are protective to a fault. Not only are they smart to a fault, they are protective to a fault. Look, when I first got this dog, Ginger, she was sweeter than she was even a month later. As a matter of fact, the more she came to know us as her family and see us as the family she is there to protect, the more protective she became. And guess what? The less friendly she became to everyone else. At first, she wasn't sure who was her family, and friends could come over. She just treated everyone like, maybe are you my mom? Are you my dad? Are you the one I'm supposed to protect? But once she knew that we were the tribe that she belonged to, then she became impossible to deal with. You could never bring a friend over because he was constantly. She knew that we were her family. Now look, there's times when we can become so tribal, and all social media has done is amplify the degree to which we are tribal. Think about that for a minute. It's true. We kind of see the us and them view of the world, and social media is not making us more social. It's actually making us more antisocial because we just choose to stay within our tribe. We become protective of our tribe. Look, I think it's good to be protective of your tribe. It's good to be protective of your family. But at the same time, we cannot do it at the expense of those. Look, Jesus tells us we don't get credit for loving those who love us. You only get credit for loving those who hate you. Everyone loves people who love them. That's what Jesus says, right, in the Sermon on the Mount. But it turns out he's calling us to be loving toward those who we used to call our enemies, to stop being quite so tribal. By the way, if you ever thought you were going to win people into the family, of any worldview, you are not going to do it by drawing stronger boundaries and becoming that barking Chihuahua, which is just here to defend your side. Look, I am not quick to jump up and become defensive about my theological positions until I know the person well enough to have a voice in their life. Certainly we are called to defend the truth. But have you ever thought about how to do that effectively? You do that effectively by first loving your enemies so that you have a voice in their lives so that you can defend truth to them. Good luck being a Chihuahua and trying to defend truth. As a matter of fact, how many times have you seen this where a politician or a leader might even be right about a policy but is despised because of a personality? Has the right policy, but according to how he's viewed, nobody wants to listen to that person. A Chihuahua, a barking Chihuahua. Nobody wants to listen to a barking Chihuahua. So one of those attributes of Chihuahuas, which is noble, the fact that they are protective, don't you become protective to a fault the way that Chihuahuas can be. So two things. Number one, don't think you're so smart that you are smart to a fault. Don't become so protective that you are protective to a fault. Third attribute of Chihuahuas. Chihuahuas are defensive to a fault. Now, there's a difference between being protective and defensive. Here's what I mean. Some of us have kind of learned a lot about a certain topic. Let's say it's your favorite sports team, and so you are able to defend your sports team. But a lot of times when we become defensive is because we run out of options. What I mean is, it's one thing to affirm a notion, to affirm a claim, to assert a claim and be positive. It's another thing to simply be defensive, like don't stop attacking me, and always be defensive. Why do we become defensive? Defensive kind of me is a sign of weakness, right? If you suddenly become defensive, it's kind of like fight or flight. Like if I've run out of the options, why do you think Chihuahuas control the dog yard? They do. And why are they so loud from the get-go? You put a Chihuahua in with bigger dogs, that Chihuahua will become an obnoxious, ankle-biting, barking mess really quick. Well, why? Because it's the smallest dog. I mean, honestly, the bigger dog could basically just eat the Chihuahua, right? If it wanted to. And the Chihuahua knows that. The Chihuahua feels like it has no good way to defend itself. Like, I don't have any good tool set. I'm not muscular. I'm not big. So all I got left is my constant venom, right? Let me just scare you off. Like, you're not quite sure what I might do to you. When in reality, if any dog would press that, they could eat the Chihuahua pretty quickly. So what we don't want to become is so backed into a corner. Now, how does that usually happen for us? Well, it usually happens for us because we don't have the tools necessary to be protective without being defensive. There's a difference. So a lot of times, you might just be that you are so understudied on something that when somebody makes a claim, you're not sure how to respond. And you feel like, I don't know. Or every time you try to respond to something online, the other person just continues to hammer you as a nail. It gets worse and worse and worse. And at some point, you're in that fight or flight mode where you haven't really studied. You've allowed this person to kind of beat you down online. And now you're at that point where you're in fight or flight mode. You're the Chihuahua who has run out of other tools, and you're suddenly, and I see people that resort to this name, it usually ends up happening by resorting to name calling. Right? Our resorting to name calling online is kind of like the Chihuahua barking in front of big dogs. And we become defensive. We don't know how to respond to that claim. We're afraid maybe we don't have a good response. Maybe the Christian worldview doesn't have a good response to that claim. And we instantly shift into barking Chihuahua mode. Really? Okay. That's what it is to become defensive. One way you can combat that is, number one, calmly realize that you don't have to win every conversation. These are not, sometimes conversations are just that, they're conversations. You don't have to win them. They're not like a chess game every time you're talking to somebody online. Number two, know something about what you're talking about. Be ready to defend what it is you believe. Understand that if there's a claim made against Christianity, it would be nice for you to know what the defense of that claim is. What is the truth about that claim? If you haven't studied well, you're going to become defensive quickly. Number three, you don't have to have all the answers right away. Be patient. I think there's a sense of urgency on social media where someone, like, you post something and someone immediately comments. And now I'm like, oh, I have to immediately comment. I can't let that thing sit there for more than 5 seconds without saying something. Well, maybe you're not prepared to say anything yet. And what's going to come out is a sense of defensiveness rather than a sense of informed protection, informed response. So, 3 things. Number one, Chihuahuas are smart to a fault, they're protective to a fault, and they're defensive to a fault. Let's try not to be those things, at least not to a fault. Take a break. When we come back, I want to give you some practical guidelines on how to maneuver online.
When I was working full-time as a homicide detective, I was also serving in the local church as a youth pastor. And the first year of kids that we graduated, seniors, by the time they came back and visited us for a Christmas break the next year, so they'd been in school maybe 10 or 12 weeks, they already were telling us that they were no longer Christians. I think we lost all but one of our graduating senior class the first year. I remember thinking, I am the worst youth pastor that's ever worked as a youth pastor. How did all these kids walk away? So we shifted everything. I was a guy who was doing a lot of stuff that was experiential in my youth ministry. My training was in the arts before I became a detective, so everything in our youth ministry was very experiential. Music and visual stuff and experiences back and forth and interactives, none of which apparently had any impact on that first class because they all walked away. So I changed everything and I shifted it all toward making the case for why this is true. We've made that our primary emphasis. Learning how to serve in the local community. Going on missions trips that tested what we were training them to learn. We took them to Berkeley, UC Berkeley. We took them to places like Salt Lake City. We wanted to have theological discussions with people who believe something different. We wanted to have philosophical discussions with people who believe something different. And there was a young man there with us, about the age of my sons, who was probably one of the quietest, sweetest guys I ever knew in youth ministry. And he was kind of timid. And that first trip we took to Salt Lake City, I don't think he said a thing. I think he stood and watched other students interact on the street, doing street evangelism. I think he was really along for the ride. Today he serves in a foreign country. And the reason why I think he is such a committed Christian on the mission field is because he got a chance to see it modeled. He got a chance to see what a forensic faith looks like, what it looks like to examine your theological views, examine Scripture through the eyes of a detective, what it looks like to develop the skills of making the case. And he just grew in his confidence. And this is not his shape. His shape is not somebody who would stand in front of a camera and talk like this. Yet he's willing to do it now because he understands that it's true. And once he became so committed and so convinced that it was true, it changed everything. I don't think he would be where he is today if he still held a rather blind faith that just believes it's true without really knowing with certainty from the evidence. He's where he is today because he holds a forensic faith.
Okay, in this segment of the podcast, I just want to give you 3 practical things you can do immediately to change the way you're perceived online and to change the way you interact online. Either if you're blogging, if you're podcasting, if you're producing content online, or if you're just engaging people on social media, which is probably what most of us are doing, right? Okay, great. This is from an article I wrote, which kind of dovetails off of that attribute of Chihuahuas being super smart. And this article is called How the Curse of Knowledge Can Become the Cause of Cursing. How the curse of knowledge can become the cause of cursing. And it really does come back to this idea that we talked about, that a lot of us, we get to a place where we think we know something, and then we kind of trot out into the social media world as if we're going to go out and make proclamations about politics, proclamations about conspiracy theories, proclamations about the nature of God or your religious beliefs, and we get out there and we just start blasting the world because we think now we know something, and it's really a curse of knowledge that can sometimes puff us up. Scripture tells us that will happen, and then we start to kind of use it, our knowledge, as a way to say, I know more than you, to separate. Look, all of Gnosticism, right, and the early heresies of the church were really about a sense that, hey, there was a secret knowledge, an esoteric, secret knowledge limited to certain groups, and that your salvation or your separation was based on whether or not you had this knowledge. This is a very ancient human inclination to separate from others on the basis of what you think you know and they don't. And so we have to be careful, and there's a couple of strategies you can take that'll help you with this. So here's the first one that I would propose that we all do, and that is to try to remember that you've been a failure in the past. You don't know everything. There's stuff that you said in the past that was probably wrong online. You probably misquoted something. Don't forget your failures. Look, it helps me. I always say that the people who are least forgiving are the people who think they have nothing to be forgiven about. The people who are least forgiving are the people who don't think they need any forgiveness. This is what Simon's problem was when Jesus was at his house, and a woman comes and starts to lavish praise and lavish and anoint Jesus, right? And Simon's thinking to himself, if Jesus knew what this woman was all about, he wouldn't even let her touch him. And Jesus says, Simon, this woman knows the degree to which she's been forgiven. In essence, that's what he says. And Simon, you didn't even wash my feet when I came in the house. Simon did not think he had anything for which he needed to be forgiven. Therefore, he was not a forgiving person himself. So if you find yourself kind of hammering down on people on social media, you're not being forgiving. You're not even being forgiving of somebody making a stray comment or an errant comment online. Really? Are you that unforgiving where you aren't even forgiving somebody's stray comment online? Well, it might be that you've forgotten all of your stray comments, all of your mistakes online, and we've all made enough. What I want to try to do always is being gracious is about me focusing on the grace that's been given to me. Me being forgiving is about me focusing on the forgiveness that I need from others and from God. So don't forget your failures. And that will help you, I think, be humble. Humility, really, I think, for me, is difficult. I think for all of us as humans, it can be difficult. But when I remember all the boneheaded things I've done, all the boneheaded things I've written about, I remember when I first started ColdCaseChristianity.com, I had an older website called PleaseConvinceMe.com. And I remember I was going to transfer some of those articles over to the new website. Only as I copied to paste each article, I actually read the articles and I couldn't copy and paste any of them without changing them because I realized, man, I was a terrible writer. And I needed to get better before I could write for this new website. Don't forget your failures. It'll help you interact with people online. Number 2, pause before you post. Don't post too quickly. Even when someone says something, especially when a family member says something, I see this all the time. Somebody sees something on the news, it makes them so mad that they get on their Facebook page and they post something really, really dramatic. And then all of us are reading that and thinking, okay, be gracious. You don't know what they just saw that caused them to post that. You don't know what they're going through in their family life to cause. You do not need to post a response. They might post something absolutely, utterly obnoxious that not only violates your worldview, but you know it actually violates their worldview too. And so you might rush to say, don't be a hypocrite. You might rush to say something to counter that. Don't do it. Pause. Allow yourself time. There's times when I immediately get a visceral response to something and I want to say something quickly because I'm having this visceral response. Okay, stop. It turns out that if you'll wait, you'll see that actually you're not that animated about it. Thank goodness I didn't post something because now I've had a chance to calm down. Time heals that kind of rage. Let time be your friend, not your enemy. Pause before you post. Third thing, if you've got a spouse, let your spouse read your stuff. I can't tell you, there's a reason why we are in these marital relationships, that God says that this is, we are one, and that I bring something to the relationship that my spouse doesn't. My spouse brings something to the relationship that I don't. There's great balance in our marriage, and I trust her with even my words. So if I'm not quite sure, I don't really send anything to a publisher. I don't send anything to a news magazine or an online source that I'm writing for. I don't post anything. I let Susie read that. Number one, she's a great editor, but number two, she can tell my tone. I recently wrote an article on a plane coming back that I was about to send, and I let her read it, and she didn't like any of my tone in any of it. And I said, I didn't even think I had that tone. But she was able to see it and read it with fresh eyes and stop me from sending something to a publisher that really wasn't the tone I wanted to represent anyway. If you've got someone like that in your life, use that person before. That means you're going to have to be slower in your response and let people, if you're going to be feisty about something, let somebody else read it. Now, if you think, well, I don't have someone, then find someone like that in your life. Find someone like that. I used to do this once in a while online. I'd text somebody who was like a mentor to me in the apologetics field to say, am I saying this right? Does this sound right? Would you say it this way? And they'll always come back and say, well, I would just change this one part. Okay, great. Use mentors to help you navigate controversial issues online. Pause before you post. Do not immediately respond. And don't forget your own failures. That'll keep you humble. I hope this strategy will help you to do better online, especially in your social media with friends and family members who you care about. And I'll see you right back here next week at Cold-Case Christianity.
To hear more from J. Warner Wallace, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. For more information on this week's topic, visit youtube.com/coldcasechristianity with J. Warner Wallace. Thank you for joining us on this Cold Case Christianity broadcast.